If a franchise goes on long enough, it'll begin to bend the formula through which it gained popularity in the first place. Sometimes that means stretching the concept a bit, and at other times, it's going in a completely different direction and totally changing what the original intention of the series even was. Lots of long-running stories across different formats do this, but video games are some of the most interesting, given how much time is put in both development and by the player themselves, as well as the whole point of the interactivity, linking a player's enjoyment with the story directly to how much they are having fun. From what I've seen, most gaming franchises either attempt to mend the fracture between what is and what was, or they completely ignore it altogether, shedding the past like dead skin. In unrelated news, Resident Evil has been around since 1995, 30 years, and I do not believe that any video game console has ever come out without some sort of representation from the franchise, save for the original Xbox, but that was a really weird console looking back on it. And the 9th installment, Requiem, or Rare for short, has finally released. And how does it relate to what we're talking about right now? Don't worry, I will get there in time. I love this franchise, man, and because I do, wow, that was an insane voice crack, and because I do, I can recognize that Resident Evil has lots of different subsects of fans. Tank controls, non-tank controls, remakes, originals, people who think Revelations 2 is better than the first game, and people who are wrong. But for the better part of 2 decades, the franchise has been split down the middle between people who strictly love the survival horror installments, with limited inventory, stalker mechanics, as well as a heavy emphasis on puzzles, and a second camp who love the action games with balls-to-the-wall ridiculous shit that's been around since Resi 4, or arguably Resi 3 Nemesis. For a time, there was an attempt to appease both groups of fans since the franchise returned back in 2017 with Biohazard. That game was straight back to basics, providing survival horror in a new first-person perspective. But for the Resident Evil 2 remake, there was enough integration of both the survival horror atmosphere in the earlier half of the game, as well as some fun action segments and side modes that came together to make a very strong installment that mostly satisfied people on both sides of the aisle. Although it is a game that still had a very weak middle act, I fucking hate that sewer so much. Resident Evil 3 Remake was all action, no fodder, and because of that, didn't really land well with fans, which is whatever. I loved that game enough for all of you. Village was the next time Capcom would try to mend the gap, so to say, with an opening ripped straight from RE4, as well as the merchant system, where you're incentivized to go and shoot more creatures in order to get more money, in order to make your weapons stronger, thus furthering the cycle. However, there was also the traditional horror stuff, a residence where you're stalked the whole time, or a horror section of the game that isn't all that fun on repeat playthroughs. I think Village was done in a way that makes for a good Resident Evil installment, but just not one that allows either part of its DNA to really shine. You know, Village reminds me a lot of Logic in that way. The Resident Evil 4 remake is pretty much perfect, though. I'd like to say I don't think anyone would disagree, but given that this is the internet, a lot of people are gonna have fucking essays about why that game is awful, but whatever. However, even though I love that game, I'd never call it scary, which was one of the indirect intentions of remaking the game, one that just still ended up falling flat. And that brings us up to date with Requiem, which had Capcom's biggest break in between installments since the franchise's return in 2017. A whole 3 years have passed since 4 Remake, and now, having actually played 9, I can see why. Resident Evil Requiem is just straight up 2 different games morphed into one campaign. It's not even really a seamless fusion, it's more like a weird homunculus, or fruit on the bottom yogurt. One half is that back to basics horror energy from Biohazard, just ramped up to 11, and the other is a pseudo-sequel to Resident Evil 4. And both are the most ideologically opposed parts of this franchise rolled into one, and they both work. Yeah, somehow the stalker mechanic didn't get on my nerves in this one, and there are whole sections as Grace where you don't have a gun at all. Every time there's a zombie or a creature chasing you, whether it's the girl, Chef, or one of the Chunk twins, they are only confined to their little areas of the map, a la Nemesis from 3 Remake. And that one change makes this all the better. The mixture of scripted appearances as well as a restriction on which encounters can take place allows the horror to still remain intact without ever becoming overbearing. So for that little section of the game, you are terrified, but it doesn't make multiple playthroughs annoying like other games have been. Resi 2, I love you. you, but get it together, sweetie. If anything, it actually makes it more fun to return to the game on higher difficulties, since some of the enemies can move even faster. I don't like that. The first half of the game is a slower paced survival horror with small segments of Leon included. And the second half is kind of oops all Leon, although there are even less Grace sections here, but they still do manage to offer a sort of espresso shot of horror. This is one of the benefits of video games as a medium with interactivity as its driving force. Because if this was, say, a movie or maybe even a comic, none of this would translate well. But because I'm playing as Grace, who's so anxious and the cards are constantly stacked against both her and the player, it makes those earlier portions of the game in the care center or the mines all the more terrifying. There were points during my first playthrough where I just had to put the controller down and come back a different day. You know, when the sun is out and I'm safe again. But then the beauty of Requiem is that once you survive as Grace, you're given the immediate catharsis of Leon completely obliterating everything and getting points for doing so. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that all the stalker type creatures in Requiem are blown to smithereens by Leon, and that's just great. I truly think that Requiem is a gold mine, not just for Resident Evil, but for most franchises and fractured fandoms out there. The answer to the ongoing franchise with a never-ending rift is not to shy away from it or to fix it, but to look at the fracture in the eye and own it. As much as I've loved every Resident Evil game leading up to 9, I usually revisit them and feel like something is missing, or maybe a section just drags the game down. An issue I really didn't have with Requiem after 5 playthroughs. That's not to say that there aren't some parts of Requiem that I don't like. I feel like we've reached a general consensus that the spark plugs section sucks, same with the orphanage, but neither of those last long enough that they actually bother me like the Sherry or Ashley sections in past games. If I do have a criticism, I think that Requiem is a bit too focused on Resident Evil 2 specifically, and not so much the other games set in Raccoon City like 1 or 3, which wouldn't be a huge deal if 2 wasn't so fresh in my mind from playing 4 just a few years back. I get it. It's been like 7 years since the Resident Evil 2 Remake released, which is fucking insane to say out loud, by the way. But this does kind of feel like a game that was meant to primarily play on that nostalgia that both Leon and the players have. Mainly the player. I don't think Leon remembers any of that stuff too fondly. However, I do appreciate the narrative purpose given to Return to Raccoon City outside of just fan service. Leon returning to the RPD directly reflects Grace returning to the hotel where her mom was murdered, showing how similar they really are, even though they are currently at opposite sides of the spectrum as RE protagonists. Throughout their few interactions in the game, Leon gives Grace what he and Claire didn't have, a mentor or a guide during one of the most traumatic days of their lives. And spoiler alert from here on out probably. Because of that, she's able to save Emily. Which, by the way, that was a very Metal Gear fucking twist to include in there. Oh yeah, we fucking cloned you, here's a daughter. What? It's not missed on me that the bad ending isn't just an outcome where Leon dies, but Emily isn't saved either. In that ending, Grace doesn't get to return to her desk job with this newfound purpose as a mother. She ends up just as sad and as lost as Leon felt following the RPD incident where Marvin and Kendo and countless others died. Losses that he went on to carry into 4 and 6 and all the other stuff that he was in. I don't really watch the movies like that. I did get drunk and watch Welcome to Raccoon City, and boy, if you want a movie that'll turn you towards alcoholism, that's something that I think not enough people have commended this game for. Not alcoholism, but the narrative cohesion that comes from Grace and Leon being our protagonists, and how that sort of mends the differences in gameplay. I really like how much Resident Evil juggles the different parts of what's expected from it. The franchise began with somewhat normal people thrown into zombie apocalypses, and has leaned more and more into the action spectacle. I made a comparison in the past of how Resident Evil 2 and 3 reflect the change in tone in Terminator 1 and 2. And that's sort of been the norm for the franchise. Resident Evil sits in this little pocket of space that only like Metal Gear also has, where the franchise has a lot of camp and ridiculous shit, but it's all played completely straight in universe. And just because there's funny stuff going on screen doesn't mean that the horror is any less evident. So if you're anybody who isn't a named character, you're still fucked. And that's why I not only think that Grace works so well as a protagonist, her performance is just so well done, but it's also why I feel that Resident Evil doesn't feel old or washed up. Some video game franchises, even ones that I love, feel like they release a new installment and That's it. It's just another game to add to the pile. But with Resident Evil, for better or for worse, it feels like all the games are interconnected, not just through lore connections or reoccurring characters, but the evolution of certain design philosophies and mechanics. So even when some of these games are the exact opposite of each other, it all does feel like one franchise that is always pushing forward. And as long as that is maintained, then I will for sure love the next game. Even if it is that rumored Code Veronica remake that I could not give less of a shit about. Also, yeah, what the fuck was that really long cameo from the Ashford twins in the Welcome to Raccoon City movie, man? Like how much of the general audience do you think even fucking remembers Code Veronica?